I took a shower with Satan.
Well, my wife is a transsexual Satan worshiper.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Okay, now we just had Pierce Redmond with us from Porkins Policy Review, and his new show here on American Freedom Radio on Tuesdays from 4 to 6 Eastern Time. Now we have William Ramsey. Everybody knows William Ramsey. He's the author of Prophet of Evil, Aleister Crowley, 9/11, and the New World Order, and also Abomination, Devil Worship in the West Memphis 3 case. Just came out with a brand new book called, where is this thing? Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. Also, too, William's starting a new radio show. He's going to be hosting a radio show called, I think it's William Ramsey Investigates.
That's it.
Okay, we're kind of scrambling around here today. It's kind of a crazy day. Anyway, William, man, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know, too, that William's been helping out produce the Opperman Report, and this guy has been a blessing from God to this show, because, we took on a second show of the week, actually a third show if you consider the member section shows, and William's been helping us book guests and find guests and stuff like that, and God bless you, William. Thank you so much for all your help.
Well, thanks for letting me help. It's really been a great opportunity for me. I've had a lot of fun, so I've been able to talk to people that I've only heard on radio shows or read their books, so it's fun from my side just to kind of chat with them.
Yeah, it's so true. You get to talk to the most interesting people in the world,
It's really true, and the wide variety, different true crime writers, conspiracy, people who have advanced degrees, a lot of interesting stories.
Yeah, and we're getting to the point now where hardly anybody turns us down anymore, right?
Well, that's good. Not really. I mean, I think I only had one person just say no. That was it. I won't mention their name.
Yeah, I know.
There's
too
hundreds
bad.
that said yes.
Yeah, that's too bad because we were just discussing his work too just a minute ago. So it would be nice. Anyway, bro, listen, you got this. First, tell us about the new radio show you're gonna be doing, which comes on right after this show here on Awake Radio and PSN Radio.
Correct. So I'm going to do a 1-hour show a week, and I'm just going to pick a subject. The first 3 shows are going to be about my books, and then I'm going to kind of move into true crime or political conspiracies or maybe secret hidden things in Hollywood, and just kind of discuss those for an hour. Invite a lot of people to talk. They can send me a text to my or Twitter to my Twitter account at occult911, and just do an hour show on any subject. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I think I've got at least 10 things I want to talk about that it will take at least an hour. So I think the audience will really enjoy it.
The new book, Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. Now, it's amazing how much influence this guy's had.
I think so. I think that, I turned over a new leaf every time, and I found out somebody else who had some connection to Crowley or a connection to one of Crowley's friends. And I really kind of, when I wrote my first book, Prophet of Evil, like 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of information about the people he influenced. And he really did try to influence people. And those people had all kinds of influence upon our modern culture in a wide variety of ways. So I really tried to trace that. It took a lot of reading, of biographies and varied sources. But I think that, I captured a lot of very famous individuals who were influenced by Crowley, whether it's the Beatles, Alfred Kinsey, Adolf Hitler, people like that. It's pretty surprising that there are connections between Crowley and Hitler, and Alan Moore, who's done tons of movies and comics, was a big Crowley fan. So I really just tried to kind of capture that. David Bowie, for example, who died recently, all admired Crowley. So there's a part of their artwork and a part of their personalities that have been influenced by somebody who died, in 1947.
Before I met you, the first time I had you on the show, I had no interest in Crowley, even a little bit. What was it about him that made him so interesting to people? What is his fascination with this man?
I think that's a great question. I didn't know much about Crowley either. I came to was curious about Crowley from 9/11. I was kind of like a conspiracy researcher, and 9/11 really led me to Crowley and his influence. And I think that there are certain people who are interested in what Crowley had to offer, which is kind of this view of total freedom and being unrestricted, and offering. And Crowley offered these ways and practices and magical rituals that were supposed to open up the mind and give people talents, And so I think that that's what the fascination is. And the interesting thing about Crowley is that it's all kind of hermetic. It's all secret. So you don't see these people openly walking around. Well, maybe these days with Crowley, but back in the day, it was all secret society stuff and people going up the grades of these internal systems, kind of like the Masons. And I think that that is the fascinating element about Crowley, is that he's largely unknown about, and there's probably people out there who we don't even know who like Crowley, but the people that we know and the events that have taken place that are influenced by Crowley are astonishing. I think, particularly 9/11.
Now, what was his time frame? When did he live? At what period of time?
So he was born in 1875 and he died in 1947. He was born of an upper middle class, or really an upper class English family. They were part of what was known as the Exclusive Brethren. They were a subset of the Plymouth Brethren, which was a very intense religious group. And he kind of rebelled against the religious upbringing that he had when he went to Cambridge, and really became interested. He said he was white hot on three things: mountain climbing, poetry, and magic. So he really had determined to be a great poet, and he left a vast repository of poetic writings, and including other types of literature. He was really a literateur, which is really somebody who's good at everything. He was an excellent writer. First try, you almost go through his manuscript and he's never really rewriting anything. So he, because of his ability, and he had tons of money, somebody's tried to guesstimate or estimate how much his inheritance was, but it was something like 20 million pounds. It was just a huge number. And he really spent it, he kind of spent it carelessly, but it really offered him the ability to really go and experience all types of different things in his life, travel the world. He circumnavigated the world twice when it was very unusual to do that. He traveled to Egypt, he traveled to the East, and all the time while he was traveling, he was gathering and garnering this information about, he's one of the early people to study yoga and Buddhism and Buddhist, mental states and things like that. So he really was kind of an adventurer in a lot of ways. He was an admirer of Sir Richard Burton, who was a person who had, one of the first Westerners who went to Mecca during the Hajj. And that was kind of what Crowley kind of saw himself as this kind of adventure, but more a spiritual adventure. And so he emulated a lot of those people of the past. He thought he was the reincarnation of Eliphas Levi, who was a kind of great magician who lived in the early 19th century, and he influenced Albert Pike, who wrote a lot of the Masonic articles. But the interesting thing about Eliphas Levi is he died in 1875, about 6 months before Crowley was born. So Crowley really was a unique figure. He was born at the apex of the British Empire, when the sun never set at the British Empire. And he was really a classist type person. He was from the upper classes, and he really had that kind of attitude. And because of his writing and he really left such a wide repository of writings that a lot of people went back. There are other people, other occultists who are influential, but it seems like Crowley really was the most influential of all of them, whether it's Albert Pike or Manly P. Hall or some of these other ones. It really seems like people found in Crowley the opportunity in the system to really become a magical practitioner and really follow exactly what he did, and I think that was his intent.
Now, a lot of people, I get, when we've done a lot of shows together,
Yeah.
and I get a lot of comments on YouTube and stuff like that, and people complain. That William Ramsey, he has Crowley all wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, I get it too.
I know, yeah, but the thing is, the whole thing about Crowley being evil and satanic. What do you make of that?
I think that if he kind of shielded it, but once you kind of analyze all of his writing, it's very clear he's a Satanist, but he was so dedicated to it, he always wrote that Satan was his benefactor, not his antagonist, because he was on that left-hand path. And he said very early, I didn't want to just be a Satanist. I wanted to be Satan's chief of staff. And that's not a verbatim quote, but that's what he said. And once you kind of sift through all of his writings, it's pretty clear he was extremely antagonistic towards Christianity and wanted to create a satanic kind of cult and empire. And so some people really don't get it because they never really parsed through Crowley's writings. So they just say he was a strange person or an occultist. But once you really get down and you read some of his writings, such as The World's Tragedy, The World's Tragedy references the birth of Christ. That's supposed to be the world's tragedy. And so Crowley was an antagonist of Christianity. And he wrote some of the most wicked blasphemies I've ever written in World's Tragedy. So to say that his most important experience was the receipt of the Book of the Law in Egypt, Cairo, Egypt in 1904, by this entity by the name of Aiwass. Kind of a veiled thing, but Aiwass was the Lord of the Air. It's a reference to Christianity that references Satan as the Lord of the Air. And at first blush, this is a perfect example of the blinds that Crowley put in his writings. At first blush, you just think he met some kind of strange god, but Crowley wrote that later on in 1940 or late 30s that Aiwass was Satan, that Aiwass was Satan. He is our benefactor. He taught us wisdom and how to be gods. It's straight out of the Bible. So people who get on and say Crowley wasn't a Satanist are ignorant, or they're willfully lying, that they're probably OTO members or something like that. And I've unfortunately had many a run-in with OTO members who deified Crowley. There's actually, within the OTO, there's a celebratory holiday called Crowley Moss, which is his birthday on October 12th. So just to, in sum, those people are either talking from ignorance or they're insiders and they just don't want people to know.
So there's no chance that when people say, well, he was just kidding about all that stuff.
Well, I've seen that. I've seen people, he wasn't serious. I've seen people call him a dilettante, a dabbler, use terms like he's a cult dabbler. I've heard people say this was a cover for his intelligence operation, that he was really an MI6 agent and his magic kind of did it. But if you read his life and what he did, there's no way that he would take the actions and all of the magical stuff when he was alone that had nothing to do with being a spy. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that it was just a big cover. He would do magical rituals all the time. He was constantly trying to break on through to the other side, so to speak. He had this Gerencerus working, the lamb thing, where he saw and wrote down and drew this entity before anybody ever talked about aliens. It's remarkable. It's really shows that he was really trying to contact the entities and successfully did, at least by his approximation or his estimation. So to say that he was a cover is, I think, naive, and I think that they just haven't really read Crowley. He really was involved in magic. If you look at all the stuff he wrote, Magic in Theory and Practice, it's not somebody who is a dilettante. It's not a dabbler. It's somebody with great experience with wide varieties of study. And I don't understand. I think that it's really people's lack of going into depth into Crowley and understanding his writing and his intent. In his life, he became the head of the OTO in 1925. Why would somebody who was just a spook become the head of a German secret society? Why would somebody who was a spook start the AA, which is worldwide magical fraternity? And it just doesn't really wash when you look at all of his actions. And that's clearly during his life, and probably all the way to the end, he was an asset of the British intelligence service, the British secret services, from the late 1890s till his death. And he had connections with tons of people in the intelligence community, and they knew him. And I write about that in Children of the Beast. Maxwell Knight, Ian Fleming, a guy by the name of what was his name? Just tons of people. Ian Fleming, there was another guy's name who was Tom Dryberg, who was a spook, who was really Crowley's heir, but he was a left-wing spook and a friend of the Crays in England. And I think it shows that Crowley was always having, these other people. There was Gerald York. So there's a ton of intelligence people that Crowley is hanging out with. And I think that Maxwell, it's just another one was Dennis Wheatley, who was kind of like the Stephen King of his age. These are all intelligence people, but they're all interested because they know they're not talking to Crowley like he is a fellow intelligence person. They're talking to him like he's a master occultist, which is very telling.
Now, how does Hitler fit into this?
So one of Crowley's disciples right around the turn of the century was a guy by the name of J.F.C. Fuller, John Frederick Charles Fuller. He was a graduate of Sandhurst. It was kind of like their West Point of England. And he wrote something, A Star in the West, about Crowley, about Crowley's writings. And he was very interested in warfare, and he went to World War I. After World War I, he became a developer of kind of tank land, well, even before World War I, tank and land battles. But the British never really emphasized that. They weren't really a land power, they were a sea power. But the Germans took interest in all of his writings. And one of Hitler's generals actually went to England to sit down with J.F.C. Fuller and talk about military campaigns. And it's actually from J.F.C. Fuller through this German general that the Hitler actually basically put together this whole J.F.C. Fuller plan for a mobile mechanized infantry or army. And that was remarkable in a lot of ways, because when Hitler had his birthday, his 50th birthday on April 20th, 1939, J.F.C. Fuller, this kind of disciple of Crowley, was one of two Englishmen invited to Hitler's birthday party. And so it was a very interesting conversation between J.F.C. Fuller and Adolf Hitler that he, when Fuller says to Hitler, "I hope you're pleased with your children." No, Hitler says to Fuller, "I hope you're pleased with your children," knowing that these tanks were all of Fuller's ideas. And then Fuller responds, "Your Excellency, they have grown up so quickly that I no longer recognize them." So it's kind of a nod to Fuller's acumen. And Hitler also, Crowley was always trying to get in contact with Hitler. But what I tried to point out in the book is that Crowley and Hitler's ideas were very similar. They had very similar outlooks on a variety of different subjects. And Hitler, in a lot of ways, was Crowley's kind of political arm. He was somebody who did a lot of things that Hitler had. Hitler was a New Ager. Hitler believed in the power of the will. He had a movie, The Triumph of the Will, and Crowley's kind of main idea is the power of the human will. He called his followers and himself Thelemites, which is a Greek term for will. And so you kind of see these similarities, these overlapping similarities between Crowley and Hitler. And a lot of people, one of Crowley's followers, a guy by the name of York, actually believed Hitler was quoting Crowley's Book of the Law. He said a lot of things that were very similar that Crowley had stated, and it was pretty remarkable. And Hitler really saw, Hitler was an anti-Christian, kind of just like Crowley. They both wanted to eradicate Christianity, but Hitler also read a book that was very similar to Crowley's book. It was called Magic, History, Theory, and Practice by Ernst Schertl. And there's a book that made its way to the United States, and I referenced the book in this book, Magic, History, and Theory and Practice by Schertl, in my book. And it's very interesting that Hitler's reading these pretty intense, esoteric, magical treatises that kind of similar to Crowley. So they're very similar. There are pretty remarkable overlaps between Hitler and Crowley.
In your book, you mentioned John. I hate to jump from Hitler to John Carradine, but it did jump out at me. What was John Carradine's involvement?
So John Carradine was one of the early OTO members. John Carradine is the father of the four Carradine brothers in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it's actually kind of just an interesting story about how Carradine was. He played Aaron in the Ten Commandments next to Charlton Heston, if people don't know. But he was really a famous actor in the 30s and 40s. And his sons all kind of went on to become actors. David Carradine, Keith Carradine, and I think the other one. But David Carradine was featured in a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies. So you see this kind of, and there's actually some Crowley numbers that Tarantino uses in those movies, 77. So it's interesting to see this kind of occult progeny in Hollywood.
Yeah, the Carradine brother too, the one that was in Revenge of the Nerds. He's in a lot of weird stuff too as well.
I think that's Robert, right? David, Keith, and Robert.
Could be Robert. I forget.
David, Keith, Robert, and Sean, I think, is what it is. But there's just a lot of interesting things. Martha Plimpton is one of the Carradine's daughters, and she's been in a lot of movies. Some of the names that I put in the book, you would recognize their face if you saw them.
Arthur C. Clarke.
So Arthur Clarke, one of the interesting things about Clarke is that he integrated a lot of the numbers that Crowley used, a lot, 1177, 93, 175, but those numbers were integrated in a lot of his books. And one of the interesting things about the monolith in 2001, A Space Odyssey, is that it's 11 feet high, which is, basically Crowley's number of magic, Crowley's number of the new aeon, this kind of deeper idea. So it's a symbolic representation of these kind of occult ideas. It's interesting that 2001 Space Odyssey correlates directly to the events of 9/11 in 2001, where two huge monoliths, the Twin Towers, went down. So we're 110 stories tall. So you see this numerological correlation between the events, the film of 2001. It shows the kind of really deep occult knowledge of Clarke and the foreshadowing of the 9/11 event. It's pretty remarkable. Right next to the Twin Towers was something called the Millennium Hotel. It was owned by the Hilton family, and it's basically a designation or representation of the monolith of 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick.
What about Kubrick? Did he have a connection to Crowley?
Not that I know of. I didn't really get too deep into Kubrick. I really just saw Clarke's numerology, and I think there's a lot more research that I could do into Kubrick and his connection to occult. I do believe that there were 11 kind of servitors at the kind of cult ritual scene in Eyes Wide Shut. There were 11 of those girls, so it's pretty clear that Kubrick must have known quite a bit about the esoteric, and he covered some of that stuff in his book. I actually covered, there was a 93 in one of his films, so I think that he knew. There are rumors that he was an OTO member, but I couldn't prove it. There's rumors that a lot of famous people are OTO members, David Bowie, and a lot of well-known figures, but it's hard to verify.
Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke, too. Now, he was accused of child molesting. Where did he live? In Bangladesh?
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, right?
Yeah, so he was single his whole life. He had a brief marriage that kind of fell apart, but at some point in his life, he really enjoyed Sri Lanka, and there was a article that was written about him where he basically kind of admitted that he paid young men for sexual relations, and it was kind of suppressed. I couldn't find it after I downloaded it. I couldn't find it on the internet anymore, and but it was basically a tacit. He basically admitted to it, and he didn't think it was much of a bother, but it was big news back in England. And I think it was pretty clear from the men there that were in Sri Lanka that he was, he was a pedophile.
Yeah, there was a documentary on him once where they showed him walking into his home at Sri Lanka, and it was a bunch of the little street kids hanging out in front of his place.
Yeah, that's it. So he was always paying money out to these young boys. So it's kind of disturbing. I kind of mentioned that in the book because I think it's a fairly it's kind of like an element of Crowley who paid for young boys too. So it's kind of Northern Africa. The place to go back in those days was Northern Africa, where those things were more allowed, and that's where Crowley went. L. Ron Hubbard used to go to North Africa, so that was a interesting tie-in between Clarke and Crowley.
Okay, off the air earlier, you were saying to ask about Wiley and the Process Church.
Right. So Timothy Wiley, one of the interesting things about Timothy Wiley is he's left quite a bit. He actually wrote a book called Love, Fear, Sex, Death about the Process Church. But he said that the Process Church studied Aleister Crowley. And you can kind of see this, and I try to map it out in my book, but this line from Crowley through Jack Parsons to L. Ron Hubbard to Scientology to the offshoot of Scientology, which was the Process Church of the Final Judgment, and those leaders. And Crowley kind of is a common denominator that flows through all those groups. So you have these occult groups, and even the Manson family, interesting enough, had Crowley tie-ins. If you read it if you read about Manson's involvement in something called the OTO Solar Lodge. So it's a pretty fascinating element of all of these kind of occult groups that they all studied or passed through this Crowley phase.
What about the Beatles?
Well, the Beatles were, probably the biggest pop band ever, right? So in the late 60s, they were really game changers. But one of the remarkable elements of them is that there's just tons. They all knew Crowley. You know, they all talk about magic. They talk about do what thou wilt, and they talk about their hatred of Christianity. So there's all these. It's basically the same theory. Sergeant Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band said 20 years ago today. Sergeant Black or Pepper Black, that's rumored to refer to Crowley, who died in 1947, and they put Crowley on the cover of their album, but they also, you know, talked about all kinds of other things about, you know, insulting Christianity, bringing in ideas from the East. So it's pretty remarkable that, you know, that they said, Paul McCartney himself, this is a direct quote, said about his music, I think it's basically magic with a K, kind of like Crowley.
Right.
There's such a thing as magic, and the Beatles was magic. So, you know, it's pretty remarkable that he would say that, and, you know, whether that's really Paul or not. But I think that you've quoted in one of your shows, and this is a direct quote from McCartney, it's something that has to be thought of magic with a K. So this is that's kind of the straight ideas from Crowley. And, you know, it's pretty remarkable how they talked about themselves as being mediums, and Yoko Ono was an astrologer. And one of their final interviews was with Playboy magazine, was where John Lennon sums up and rephrases Crowley's famous dictum, do what thou wilt shall be all law. He says the whole Beatle idea was to do what you want, right? To take your own responsibility, do what you want, and try not to harm other people. Do what thou wilt, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, which is basically the same phrase as Gerald Gardner, who was one of the first witches. That was kind of the Wiccan Rede, which is do what you want and harm ye none, or something.
Oh, boy. You got in here Blondie. What's the story with that?
Well, it just was one of the first members of Blondie was a guy who was an OTO member, and his name is Gary Lockman. He writes tons of books. He's written books about Aleister Crowley, and he just talks. I mean, he was interesting. He talks about his magic life, so it's kind of an interesting musical tie-in to Crowley and this guy Gary Lockman. If you read all his books, they're all about the occult. So he's actually around, but he just talks about, you know, doing stuff that Crowley did. So it's just another time thing. And one of the interesting things is that when he was officiated, when he became a member of the OTO, one of this underlying characters who I write about in this book is a guy by the name of Grady McMurtry, who was a caliph of Crowley's order and sat at the foot of Crowley when Crowley was old and aged in England. But this guy, Grady McMurtry, has ties to Gary Lockman, Charles Manson, and all these other kind of famous people who knew Crowley. And he was in LeVay. He was known to LeVay, but Grady McMurtry was an interesting guy. When Charles Manson did all his murders, Grady McMurtry called the FBI and said, no, Charles Manson was never a member of the OTO. So he really tried to deny it right away. And I think that he was just trying to shield all the other members. But the reality is that Manson was actually the highest level of Scientology. He was, according to one writer, Manson was a mid-range member of the process. And he probably was a member of an OTO offshoot. So it's really some of these questions nobody's really properly asked Manson, but it's an interesting kind of tie-in between Manson and McMurtry directly back to Crowley.
But no, Blondie, wasn't there a Blondie connection to the Process Church as well? Or did someone else tell me that?
I don't know. I didn't come across anything like that. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I've seen pictures of Blondie with this guy by the name of Brian Butler, who was a disciple of Kenneth Anger, who I cover in my book.
Okay.
So Blondie kind of hangs around with some of these people. I couldn't put some of these pictures. I would love to publish the pictures, but, you know, for copyright reasons, I couldn't do it. But there's some pretty remarkable pictures out there of a lot of famous people with Kenneth Anger and his kind of functioning disciple or henchman by the name of Brian Butler. This guy lives in LA, whose girlfriend, as you know, is Tom Petty's daughter.
Right. Okay. Yeah. We talked about that, right?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Okay. Did I send you that?
So it's weird. I mean, once you really start uncovering these things, it's remarkable how many people who are famous are tied in. I just read the other day that Kurt Cobain's daughter, Frances Bean, is going to be at some shindig with Damien Echols, who's an OTO member.
Really?
Yeah. So it's pretty remarkable.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Well, Hank would flip out if he heard that.
I'll find it just a sec.
What about Ozzy Osbourne?
Well, he wrote a book. He wrote a song called Mr. Crowley. So
right.
he talks things about Crowley. He knows a lot about astral travel, and there's a picture of Osborne, as a matter of fact, with Damien Echols out there. But it's just another interesting tie-in between Crowley and kind of modern music.
But now, Ozzy pronounces it Crowley.
Crowley, right.
Yeah.
So the thing that Frances Bean is going to be at, it's called Crime on Canvas. It's in downtown Las Vegas, September 23rd to 25th, 2016.
Get out of here.
At the Western Hotel.
Wait, when is it?
So, September 23rd to the 25th, 2016, featuring Damien Echols, his kind of buddies, David Stupakis, and there on there is Frances Bean. She goes by Frances Bean.
No, I can probably find out I can probably get in there. Okay, I should get that.
I'll send you the flyer right now.
What was that? Yeah, I did it, yeah. J.K. Rowling, and this one always bugged me.
Well, she obviously, when you really kind of peel the onion back on her show and all her books, she is deeply knowledgeable about the occult, witchcraft, and Western esoteric ideas, particularly, just all kinds. Basically, Harry Potter. Okay, so in the fundamentals of magic, the magician inculcates both the pentagram and the hexagram, the 5-sided star and the 6-sided star, and you're supposed to be a conglomeration of the microcosm and the macrocosm, including all of these other ideas. So Harry Potter is a 5-letter. Harry is a 5-letter word. Potter is a 6-letter word. So he has the magician. He's been hit by the lightning bolt, which is symbolic of Satan falling from heaven, and his wand is 11 inches long. And she puts all this. I really didn't go in true detail with all of her stuff, but she, just on my cursory reading of her, it's pretty apparent that she has tons of information about the occult in there.
Or that someone else wrote it.
Well, that's always been a suspicion, is that it was a team effort and that she's a front person.
Yeah.
Basically, it's let's see. Her whole thing is that she called her book, the original title of the book isn't the first book isn't the Sorcerer's Stone, it's the Philosopher's Stone. And it's the whole idea of, changing base metals into gold. It comes from the alchemy. And so the whole, there's a subtext of Western alchemical tradition in her books. And she puts in this guy in her book. One guy's Fleming, who's a famous French alchemist. And, it's just remarkable that she has all that stuff in there.
Now,
So, it reflects deep knowledge.
Kenneth Anger, what's his connection to Crowley?
So Kenneth Anger was really a kind of a groundbreaking filmmaker. He was from a very early age. He grew up in Santa Monica, but he was always making these kind of short films. But he, at a very early age, he became in contact with Alfred Kinsey. They shared a mutual interest in Crowley, and Kinsey was trying to find Crowley's diaries. And so at some point, they traveled together to Crowley's Abbey of Thelema in Sicily. And there's pictures of them at the Abbey of Thelema, as a matter of fact, under a picture of Crowley. And at the time, the Abbey was owned by two brothers who built a wall down the center of the place because they hated each other. But Anger's actually was filmed with Kinsey. He was taking part in some of Kinsey's so-called sex films, and there's actually pictures. There's films of him with in Anger. So there's also pictures of Kinsey very early. With Anger at Crowley's Abbey of Thelema, which I cover in my book. But he had a pretty. He's still alive, which is remarkable. I think he's in his 80s. He lives. I actually know where he lives in Hollywood, but he still goes to shows. He does go to art shows, and he's been around. And like I said earlier, he's friends with a guy who's an active Crowley aficionado by the name of Brian Butler. They recently, within the last couple of years, they did one of Crowley's rituals, which was the invocation of Beausoleil in Venice. And it was rumored that James Franco was going to show up and do it, participate in this rite of Beausoleil, where you actually put a person in there, put a rag over his head, and then try to summon a spirit through that person. So it's a pretty heavy-duty ritual. And Anyway, Anger was really a fan of Martin Scorsese, and he was kind of around, kind of like a Leary figure. He's friends with a lot of these people. One of the interesting things about Anger is Bobby Beausoleil lived with Kenneth Anger in a place called the Russian Embassy, which is kind of close to the Civic Center in downtown LA. It's actually up the street, kind of in between the Civic Center and Haight-Ashbury. And there's tons of pictures. I have some in my book of Beausoleil in front of a picture where it says, "Do what thou wilt." And Beausoleil was really one of the first family members to be arrested for the murder of Gary Hinman. And it's kind of an interesting connection that's left out of a lot of the Manson narratives, that Beausoleil was friends with Kenneth Anger, this guy who really who's a self-confessed warlock who does Crowley rituals in his movies and says that the thing I'm trying to sell is Aleister Crowley. And he's said all this stuff, and I included in my book, he's got, all these tattoos that are very similar in style to the tattoos that Damien Echols makes. And he's just been around. Anger's been around. He actually sought out and became friends with another film director who I include in my book, a lesser known film director by the name of Charles Kamel. But the reason that he's important is that his dad was friends with Crowley, and Kamel literally sat on the knee of Crowley when Crowley talked to his dad. So Kamel his most famous probably movie was Performance, which had Mick Jagger in it. And for its day, it was a really debaucherous type of film, and kind of got the guy blackballed. And he actually ended up doing YouTube videos, believe it or not. I think it was for In the Name of Love. It was by this Charles Kamel guy who sat on the knee of Crowley and who was friends with Kenneth Anger. I have a picture of him, Charles Kamel, Jodorowsky, who was another kind of Crowley aficionado, Dennis Hopper, who was rumored to be an OTO member, and Kenneth Anger, who's an OTO member. It's pretty remarkable how these kind of people who are either interested or obsessed with Crowley were kind of people who put their stamp on Western and world culture.
And what about Anger's involvement with Adult Swim or the Cartoon Network? What do you know about that?
I don't know anything. I've never heard anything. What is it? Do you know?
Well, yeah, I know that he did an interview with the people who run Adult Swim. I think he's heavily involved. Someone have to get back to us on that, because I definitely heard that before.
I haven't heard anything, but he has tons of interviews. People from all over the world, French directors, He was part of the early French cinema when he was in France, and so he is still kind of this cultural figure of the avant-garde to this day. And people from all over the world interview him, and you can see him online. There's interviews from a variety of different sources talking to him about his early life and his friendships. And he was friends with, included in my book, a girl by the name of her name was Gerald York. He was actually friends with Gerald York, who was really one of Crowley's early advocates or apostles. But he actually sought out and tried to contact all these people who knew Crowley and kind of pick their brains. And one of them was this guy Gerald York, who was one of Crowley's kind of early friends. But another one was a lady by the name of Jane Wolfe, who was kind of an early actress in Los Angeles. But she actually went to Crowley's Abbey of Thelema. When she came back to Los Angeles, she lived with Kenneth Anger. So it's pretty fascinating that he was living with somebody who knew Crowley intimately. And I include her a lot in my first book, Prophet of Evil. But, that was really kind of the goal of the book, is to show this kind of like tree of connections between Crowley and all these modern people. But Kenneth Anger, really remarkable. He was friends with famous singer Smith. I forgot his first name. But he just has really just been around.
Yeah. Now, what about Bobby Beausoleil? Is he still alive?
Yeah. Anger was friends with Elliott Smith before he killed himself. But Beausoleil is still in jail, and I think he married some lady who was a witch, and he has 4 children, so he's still kind of going. And he worked for Anger. He did a musical score from prison. Right. So
what the hell?
It was a long story, but Anger ended up in Europe with Jimmy Page, who was supposed to write the score for Lucifer Rising.
Right.
But things went wrong. Their relationship blew up, and Anger, who was earlier had Beausoleil, wanted to be part of it, went back to Beausoleil after he was in jail and allowed him, and Beausoleil was a very talented musician, and allowed him to finish the score of Lucifer Rising. But Beausoleil had an earlier band when he was in San Francisco in the late 60s. It was called the magical powerhouse of Oz. And it was magical was spelled with a K. It's a remarkable name. Oz relates to 77 in Crowley's system. And they used to play at really debaucherous meetings in San Francisco at that time in the swinging 60s.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Like connections that go back.
It's just incredible.
What about if you look at L. Ron Hubbard, for example? His son really told the whole story about his dad. He was with his dad from the very beginning. You know, his dad was at the OTO Lodge in L.A. in 1946 or 45 or 46. In 1948, he sets up Dianetics, and in 1950, he sets up Scientology. So it's a very tight, yearly kind of connection from there. Those early years of Scientology, his son went to work with him and said that his dad would sit around and, fondle Crowley materials before the next day's lecture and talk to him all about Crowley, and that he wanted to sit on the throne of the beast, which was Crowley. Hubbard mentions Crowley tons of times in his early lectures. And one of the interesting things about Hubbard is, like, this guy who's probably written one of the best books about Hubbard. His name is John Atack. He wrote a book called The Piece of Blue Sky. When he really sat down to research Hubbard, what he was surprised by is that the person who influenced Hubbard the most was Aleister Crowley. He was shocked. It was all Crowleyism, He basically was rephrasing and restating Crowleyism, and he had the same anti-Christian statements. Hubbard said that God was a man who lived in a leather jumpsuit and lived in a tree, and all this really crazy stuff. Actually, what Hubbard said was that Christianity was an implant from the galactic overlord, and that you had to really excise Christianity and the whole idea of Jesus Christ from your mind. He would say that to his followers. He said that in one lecture. So, it's pretty remarkable when you put it all together. I don't know, some people have talked about the stories of Parsons and Hubbard have been retread, but I don't think anybody has really put together all these people in one place in one book. Anger, Page, Hubbard, Parsons, Crowley. And, I still put a little bit of Crowley in the book too, so people could still get just Leary, all those people. I mean, Leary himself is another guy who said, I'm carrying on the work of Aleister Crowley. He said that openly. And Leary really was probably one of the main changers of culture of the 20th century, really. Person who was a Johnny Appleseed of LSD, who advocated, all kinds of license and chaos. And he's actually, it's remarkable. Leary himself is sitting with Aldous Huxley, who knew Crowley, and actually Crowley painted Aldous Huxley's portrait. And here's Aldous Huxley in his later years, in the early 60s, telling or talking to Leary about LSD. And I include that in my book. So just remarkable ties, that a lot of people would overlook or not be interested in.
Yeah, it really is. Now, Paul McCartney. There's a picture of a young Paul McCartney on one of the albums, too, that looks a lot like a young Crowley. And people will look at Damien Echols, too, and say he looks like a young Crowley. What do you make of this?
If you look at Echols' booking photo, which I included on the cover of Abomination, he's taking kind of a head pose that's the same as Crowley in one of these pictures.
Really?
Pretty remarkable. But I think that's one of the interesting things about a lot of these guys is they want to emulate Crowley. They want to emulate his life, and a lot of them think that they're reincarnation of Aleister Crowley. Some of them do. I'm not surprised that people want to look like him. Not surprised at all.
Okay. And now, what do you make of the whole story about Barbara Bush?
Well, it's one of those things that doesn't go away. I've researched it. I've tried to find the connection. I've tried to find proof of, all the numbers come together. That's the whole thing. Is that I know for a fact that Crowley was in France after he got kicked out of the Abbey of Thelema, after it was shut down by Mussolini. He was with a guy by the name of Frank Harris. His girlfriend was O'Hara. And at the time, Crowley was doing something called the ECL, which was Eratocomatose Lucidity. It was one of his magical practices, and it needed female servitors. And the rumor is that Barbara Bush's mother was one of the servitors. And you got to remember, at the 20s, rich people in the States all wanted to go to France. That was kind of the city of lights, and it was this place of culture, literature, Hemingway, all these people. And so when she came back, she had Barbara Bush, and she had a marriage to George Bush. She was 16, he was 18. had all this elements of a arranged marriage. If you see a picture of her with her original family, which I have, she's an outlier. She's a genetic outlier. She does not look like her father. She doesn't look like her brothers and sisters. And so, you know, there's definitely this kind of eerie similarity between her and the things that she says. If you look at all of her statements, they sound like they're coming out of the mouth of Crowley. Oh, this is good for these people. When all those poor people ended up in the stadium and
New Orleans.
Katrina. After the Katrina, yeah. She's like, oh, this is working out really great. It was awful. You know, it was like a total madhouse. So she had a very callous, kind of classist down look on people, kind of like Crowley. So it's hard to prove. You know, I can't prove it, but I also can't say she looks just like him. He has the same head, acts the same, and there's, you know, strange that her son is the president when 9/11 happens. That has all of Crowley's numbers in it and all his numerology, and actually puts into place Crowley's ideas for, you know, this kind of new world order, this idea of changing the world to your will, and, you know, creating I don't know, you know, Crowley's idea was this kind of new era of magic where you had an elite running everything and just a herd underneath, you know, and that was really his idea. And in some ways you can see the presidency of George Bush like that.
But let me double check with you, because I think I might have missed it. It is 100% proven that her mother did live with Crowley, right? Pierce.
She was, my understanding.
Because there's letters.
Yeah, there were supposedly letters that I haven't seen.
Oh, really?
She was there. But the fact was, there is proof that she was friends with Frank Harris's girlfriend at the time, who was O'Hara, who was American. Frank Harris was British, just like her. So that was where the connection was.
So you could not confirm that there were these letters, because I always heard that there were these letters.
No, I have not seen those letters.
Oh, okay.
Somebody told me about the letters and all this stuff, but I have not seen the letters. But the time, I have confirmed that the time the mother was in France was the time Crowley was there.
Okay.
1924 or 25, I think it was.
Also, have you ever taken a look at the Bush sons when they were young, like 18 and 20 years old?
Yeah, it's all the same. Man.
They all resemble Crowley.
They have the same look, same hair as Crowley. Yeah. Big head, big jaw.
Yeah, that's
Crowley was actually Irish. He was of Irish descent. He had kind of a block head, you know. So, yeah, I mean, it's an amazing story. It's really a matter of historical importance, really, world historical importance, to see if that's the truth. I mean, it's probably a key to an understanding of all kinds of political policies that have been put in place in the United States. You know, I mean, Crowley, it's pretty remarkable. The Bush family and Crowley overlap in a lot of ways. You know, Crowley believed in breeding people. He believed in eugenics. He believed in the slave shall serve. That was his constant idea. You know, so he had a very the opposite of egalitarianism. He had an elitist view, stone cold elitist, and never changed really. So. Yeah, it's remarkable.
What about Ian Fleming?
Well, Ian Fleming was, you know, before he became famous as a writer of James Bond series, he was a heavy-duty intelligence op. He came from a banking family. The Fleming family was I think they were Scottish. It was a banking family that was worth tons of money. And he put Crowley in his first film, the first book. The Shift was really an amalgam of Crowley, and that was stated by Ian Fleming's biographer, a guy by the name of Pearson, who worked with Fleming before the war when he was a journalist. And there was an interesting story where Crowley is tied into the flight of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the third in command of Nazi Germany, a friend of Adolf Hitler from the early days, 1922, 1923. And they tried to Rudolf Hess dressed up and took a flight to northern England in an attempt to reach a right-wing group called the Link that he believed would negotiate with him to stop the war and basically, you know, stop the war between England and Germany. Well, the rumor is, and there actually are, I researched it pretty well, and what the rumor is that Fleming set up a fake statement to Rudolf Hess was very much into astrology. He was really an occultist, kind of like a lot of the other members of the Nazi Party. But he had his court astrologer, and the rumor is that Fleming fed the astrologer the right information for dates and times, and that it was a good idea to go. And Hess got into this single-man plane with a lot of gas and flew to northern England. And when he crashed, they wanted to get Crowley to talk about Hess because he knew all this occult stuff. The rumor was, and I couldn't verify it, is that Hess actually got in to some kind of strange outfit with all kinds of occult insignia with planets and stuff when he took the flight. And so Fleming is, talking with his buddy, trying to get Crowley and see if Crowley would be interested. And there's a letter that actually exists between Fleming and Crowley that Crowley is offering his services to, talk to Hess and see what he knows. So it's pretty interesting.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. So he says, here it is. Here's from Crowley. He says, "Sir," this is to Fleming from Crowley, "if it is true that Herr Hess is much influenced by astrology and magic, my services might be of use to the department. And in case he should not be willing to do what you wish." He references JFC Fuller, Thomas Dryberg, Carl Germer, "could testify to my status and reputation in these matters. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, Aleister Crowley." That's to Fleming.
Oh my God. Okay.
So you see Crowley involved in these, these things. And Fleming was really a master, really kind of a master spy. He was an attaché with the kind of Godfrey, who was the head of the British Admiralty. Really, the most important part of the British, military thing was their fleet. And Fleming was involved in the creation of the CIA. He used to go to Bletchley Park to talk to Alan Turing, the inventor of what broke the Enigma machine and started computers. Really, Alan Turing is really the advent of the binary system for computers. And so Fleming, and there's a picture in my book of him with Lucky Luciano. So he was negotiations with him, talking about the mob helping avoid, helping fight against the Germans when the Allies, landed in Sicily. So Fleming's a really remarkable guy. And there's a lot of occult stuff in his books too, but I didn't really have time or the inclination to include that stuff.
And someone in the chat room is asking about Courtney Love or Nirvana. Any connection to Crowley?
I couldn't find any. I really didn't research them that much. I never really saw anything overt. But I do know that I heard that I know that that Cobain went to Burroughs. He actually is a picture with Kurt Cobain with Burroughs, who, my understanding, is a big-time Crowley fan.
Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of that information on him. I really need to study Burroughs in greater detail.
Yeah, you got to look into William S. Burroughs. A lot of interesting stuff with him. He talks about writing him backwards and doing backwards stuff as well. And he knew all about the Mayan calendar. He was talking about the Mayan calendar way back in the 50s.
And ayahuasca.
Oh, really?
He's one of the early ayahuasca guys. He knew all kinds of stuff. He knew the cut-up techniques that Kurt Cobain used in his writing his lyrics. And yeah, Burroughs. There's really a book that should be written with all the pictures of people who's been with Burroughs. Like, all these people love and went and saw Burroughs as this kind of like, adventure of those kind of ideas, really.
Yeah, and people should know he shot his wife. Supposedly they were playing William Tell, and he had an apple on her head, and they went to shoot the apple off her head and shot her in the head. So that's the story, anyway. That's
the story, yeah. I mean, I'm rumored to be a CIA hitman. That's what I haven't verified that at all, but that was supposedly his job. Have you heard that?
No, I have not heard that. But listen, we're down to about the 3 minutes. So why don't you tell people where they can find you, that kind of stuff?
I am on occultinvestigations.com. You can buy my book signed, $20. I think it's really worthwhile. It's 350 pages of writing. I've got...
yeah, the book is huge, by the way. Yeah, this book is really... Yeah.
My footnotes are 762 footnotes. I have a huge bibliography. You can see all the stuff I read. And I got tons of pictures. And occultinvestigations.com. Also, I'm a lot on Facebook under William Ramsey. I'm at Twitter as occult911. But eventually the book is going to be on Amazon in probably the next couple weeks. It's not there yet, but you can get it at occultinvestigations.com.
Are you sure? Because I just I went to Amazon right before this, and
it's on there. Well, it might be.
No, maybe not. No, yeah, maybe not. Okay.
Well, I had it on there, and then I took it down. I was just selling it through my site. So
okay, and
I get a better spread if I sell it through the website.
I hear you. The only thing is, it's such a hassle mailing these. Hey, do you have problems with people getting their books? People tell you they never got the book.
I haven't got any feedback that they haven't got the book yet.
See, people are after.
For all the people that I've sent it to, nobody said I didn't receive it.
I got to start going to a different post office because I got a feeling I made too many enemies.
Somebody has all your stuff at their house, bro.
Yeah, I know. Hey, so now you got a show coming up tonight. I'll call you up at exactly at the hour, okay?
Perfect.
But what do you got planned for tonight's show?
I'm just going to talk about Prophet of Evil, my first book, how I got into it, about 9/11, and talk about Crowley, and I'll take chat, or anybody can go to, I'll have my Twitter feed open at Occult 9/11, and people can send me questions, and I can talk on any subject. If you want to talk about the West Memphis 3, we can do that too.
Okay, so the first show is going to be about the cult 9/11 and Crowley.
9/11, Prophet of Evil, and Aleister Crowley.
Excellent. William Ramsey, thank you so much, brother.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Good night. Okay, all right. Now, William Ramsey, we're going to be starting a brand new show with him in 5 minutes at exactly, let's see, it's going to be exactly 7 o'clock. I hope I can get this all going correctly because I'm going to be producing them. It's going to be on all the stations I'm on. I just talked to People's Internet Radio. It's going to be on there as well. It's going to be on awakeradio.us. It will be on People's Internet.
We're starting to get a little concerned about this whole hell thing. What's the dealio on that?
I took a shower with Satan.
Well, my wife is a transsexual Satan worshiper.